So my mentorship this past quarter has been pretty interesting because I've gotten to experience both the end of session, the middle and end of session, as well as the post-session season, which is just as exciting but in a very different way. So the rest of session, which I didn't get to cover in my last journal, was perhaps the more interesting part because there's a lot of bills being passed by the end of session because they need to get them out of committee. But also you have crossover, which is when the bills that are passed in the House get sent to the Senate and when the bills that are passed in the Senate get sent to the House. And you get to see this kind of the difference in bills that are passed between the different committees and how different committees or different houses deal with those bills and the processes thereof, which was really interesting for me because Delegate McClellan, of course, serves in the Courts of Justice Committee and the Civil and Criminal subcommittees, and that's also, it's the most interesting committee, honestly, for the House, and is also the most interesting committee for the Senate. So it was really great to see both of the bills that the House and the Senate served within those subcommittees because they were surprisingly very different. One of the most interesting bills that I want to cover was the electric bill, the electric chair bill, which actually got national recognition, incredibly. It was cool for me to actually sit in the committee session when this bill was being discussed and then go home and see it trending on Facebook. It was very surreal to be kind of a part of a mentorship that was discussing that. But anyways, the premise of this bill was to basically legalize the use of the electric chair for people who are on the death penalty or who are on death row. And this was previously outlawed in Virginia because we had turned to using injections. But now with the rising cost of these drugs that are used to lethally inject those who are on death row, and because it's become less and less available to get access to these drugs, a lot of the proponents in the Department of Corrections were calling upon us reenacting different methods of executing criminals. For me, it was crazy to kind of be in that committee session and think, well, personally, this is my personal view on the matter, but I thought we were kind of going back in time. I thought using the electric chair was almost medieval to compare to the methods we've now come to, and it was disappointing for me to see that Virginia, or that the House and the Senate both passed this bill, and for me at least, fortunately, Governor McCullough vetoed the bill, and it's not likely to get overridden, but it was still almost surreal to be in that committee session where they were discussing this almost medieval technique of executing individuals and that it actually passed. Another more lighthearted note of session that I kind of wanted to make note of that I thought was fun and interesting was that Delegate McClellan and a lot of the other delegates in the House played a prank on one of the younger delegates, or one of the newer delegates who had just been recently elected. So when his bill came to the floor to be voted on by the entire House, they all voted no. I guess it was this big orchestrated prank that they had all discussed ahead of time, but everyone voted no. And then at the very last minute, they all tried to change their vote as a kind of just to scare him a little bit, almost like an initiation. But unfortunately, and kind of hilariously, Delegate McClellan didn't change her vote fast enough, so she had to stand up in front of the whole House of Delegates and kind of make light of this fact that she had accidentally voted no on a bill she wanted to vote yes on because she was trying to pull a prank on a younger delegate. And I thought that was a very lighthearted and cool way to see more of the humanized side of our government and to see that these really are delegates just having fun and enjoying, enjoying their job as well. Another really, really exciting, and this is personally very exciting, and I discussed it in some of my daily activity summaries, but one of the inmates, Jose Rodriguez, that I've worked closely with, and I've actually talked about him quite a bit in a few of my journals, and he's one of the biggest inspirations for my research on felon disenfranchisement. But our office and me specifically have worked, and I specifically have worked with Jose on getting conditional pardon by Governor McCullough because, and I think I've detailed this more in past journals, but he basically got a very long sentence of 57 years for a felony possession and intent to distribute marijuana that was convicted with very little evidence, mostly just testimony, which I thought was outrageous. But luckily, I think it was about May, I got to help write, or I did write, the recommendation for a conditional pardon that Delegate McClellan signed for Jose. So it was like our letter of support for his application. And we just got word a few weeks ago that he received the conditional pardon, which is incredibly rare and really validating as an intern myself to know that I personally wrote that letter of recommendation and he was granted the conditional pardon. I mean, there's no way to know whether or not that recommendation specifically made or made his case, but it was still cool to be a part of that bigger process and to help him get out of prison after almost 18 years of serving for this crime that some consider pretty small nowadays. So it was an incredible news to hear. And so that's kind of a lot of what we covered during session. It was a lot of going into committee, watching these bills get passed, watching some more controversial ones that came out of Virginia, and then also getting to interact a little bit more with Jose and seeing some of the lighthearted side of our legislature. After session, which has been these past couple of weeks, we've had to tie up some loose ends. Like, we still deliver the resolutions that we passed. For example, if we passed a resolution for recognizing an individual for an incredible achievement or the death of a family member, we like to give a hard copy of those resolutions to the family or to the individual. So kind of maintaining the logistics of that, of handing those out. We also do an annual filing and inventory check after session. So that's a lot of what I've been doing this past week, is literally counting out the pamphlets and the folders and the business cards and all of this that we have in the office so that we know how much to order before, especially over the summer, but before the next session and before the fall, and filing the incredible amount of paper that we receive during session. Because session is so fast-paced and everyone's moving, you don't really have time to kind of sort everything and file it like we should. So we take the time as interns, and along with Abby, our legislative aide, after session to completely file everything, get everything organized, all of the emails from constituents, from inmates, from fellow delegates, etc., as well as the schedules and itineraries from every day in session. Any and every piece of paper that goes to the office gets organized somehow and goes through multiple checks. So it's a pretty organized office once we get the time and availability to do so. So that's most of the mentorship side of what I've been doing. It's been incredible to see this session and the after session, getting to work with constituents and getting to work with Jose and the inmates, and that will continue until the end of my mentorship, I'm sure. But the research side of my mentorship has also really started to pick up because, I'm getting to delve more and more, especially after session, into my research now that there's more time. And it's been incredibly interesting to see the evolution of felon disenfranchisement in different states. I'm measuring or investigating 5 different states and their histories in this issue, and surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly for some, Virginia has been the most recent, or has had the most recent action. We were very stagnant for decades. We didn't allow anybody convicted of a felony to ever regain their voting rights. And then in 2013, Governor McDonnell moved to allow those who were convicted of non-violent crimes, so for example, like drug possession or tax evasion, or those kind of non-violent felonies, for them to personally reapply for their civil rights to be restored. And then Governor McClellan in 2014 kind of expanded that movement, or that step that Governor McDonnell took, to allow for individuals to have of non-violent crimes to automatically have their rights restored. It's still not quite as automatic as it might sound, but these are incredible steps that Virginia's been taking in the past few years, and I'm excited to see if this exponential growth will continue. But it's really interesting to compare that to Kentucky or Iowa, for example, where there's literally been kind of no action for a long time. Even with former Attorney General Eric Holder making these calls for the increase of felon suffrage and for the increase of restoring civil rights, there are still states like Kentucky and Iowa that have been very stubborn about making any movements. And then on the other spectrum, we have states like Vermont and Maine that have always been completely liberal in their policies of allowing felons to vote even while physically incarcerated. So I think for me, my favorite part about my research is that I've been able to see the differences between those states. But also, I've seen a lot of research relate to amendments of our Constitution that I didn't previously anticipate. Because I'm studying felon disenfranchisement, I expected a lot of my research to relate to the 15th Amendment right to vote, or to, the 14th Amendment guarantee to equal citizenship and all of that. But I never expected it to relate to the 10th Amendment, which says that any rights that are not, or any powers that are not afforded to the federal government are afforded to the state government. And I realized that that came up when you see that a lot of the Department of Corrections are managed at the state level. And that's why you see this disparity in rights among states. I also saw it relate, or a lot of my research also relates to the 8th Amendment. Some scholars argue that disenfranchising felons is almost a subset of cruel and unusual punishment. So it's been really interesting to see this also relate back to we the people, because of course we do a lot of study of the Constitution and the amendments or the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, and I didn't anticipate seeing that many connections, but because felon disenfranchisement wasn't an issue when the Constitution was created. But it's been really interesting to see the evolution of the Constitution and Bill of Rights and how they are now applied to issues like felon disenfranchisement and Supreme Court cases that are even dealing with it. Like Evan v. Abbott is a Supreme Court case that's going on during this term, which asks whether inmates or people who are incarcerated in states where they can't vote, whether they should be counted in the voter population. So when state governments are drawing congressional districts, should they be counting inmates as a population of a district? Because obviously it'll shift how you draw a district if you count inmates or if you don't. So those are really interesting contemporary examples of how this has become a constitutional issue as well. And furthermore, I can actually also relate it to my work in comparative government right now with Mr. McGuire, because I've gotten to see, I'm not really focusing on the international aspect of felon disenfranchisement, but it is interesting to see how different countries handle felon disenfranchisement, albeit not a lot of countries, or actually no countries, have as many incarcerated citizens as the United States does, so it is kind of an unprecedented issue in the international community. But it is interesting to see countries like Norway or some of the other Baltic nations having more lenient or flexible policies regarding restoring the rights of felons. And then you have countries like China or of course North Korea that are completely harsh and pretty unforgiving. So it's very interesting for me personally and validating for me to see these connections that I can draw, not just between my mentorship and my research with Jose and the inspiration he's provided, but also with my We the People class in the constitutional amendments, or with my comparative government class and how different countries handle felon disenfranchisement through their governmental systems. But it's been really rewarding, and I can't wait to see the culmination of my research project. And so now I'm going to introduce you to some vocab. I'm going to do it a little bit differently because I think it's kind of boring to hear me talk about it for minutes. So I'm just going to give you some of the vocab words and their definitions that I've come across in the past quarter with my mentorship.